Welcome to Absolute Trust Talk with your host, Kirsten Howe. Absolute Trust Talk brings you tips, tools, advice, and interviews to help you build a reliable knowledge base on estate planning, business, and finance to start preparing for your future today.
Hello and welcome to Absolute Trust Talk. I'm Kirsten Howe, and this is our live streaming podcast at Absolute Trust Council. Today, we are going to pick up where we left off in our last episode, talking about community property and separate property. In the last episode, we kind of laid out some of the basics and what we are looking at when we're doing planning. Today, we're going to share with you maybe some stories, some horror stories, things that went wrong in the realm of community property and separate property in estate planning, and what we did to fix the situation. There's almost always some kind of a fix. Again, joining me for this really fun conversation is my colleague, Ruth Kohler Burke. She is also an estate planning attorney. Her company is Kohler Hurley LLC, and they're in Walnut Creek. Ruth does, her work is similar to ours, probates, trust administrations, estate planning, but she brings a lot of litigation experience to her practice, which I think is particularly helpful when we have families that aren't exactly getting along. And that happens from time to time, believe it or not. So Ruth, welcome back. And thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to talking to you about this.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You are most welcome. Okay. So as I said, last time we talked about the issue of character. That is separate property versus community property. We call that the character of the property. And we talked about some of our planning techniques, some of the things we think about. Today, we're going to talk about a few examples of poor or non-existent planning and what you can do when those kinds of things happen. Ruth, do you want to get started?
Sure. So if someone dies without an estate plan, it's called intestacy. And who gets things then? Where does everything go? And really, the state of California has laid it all out in the probate code. And there are different rules for distribution depending on whether the property is characterized as community property or separate property.
Right. So because of those different rules, we can have results that people didn't contemplate, that if they had taken the time to do planning, they probably would have done differently. The basic rule is if you die intestate and you have community property, your surviving spouse gets the community property.
Right.
If you die intestate and you have separate property, your surviving spouse may get the separate property, but not if you have children who survive you. Then they are going to get a share of your separate property. And if you have a deceased child, but a grandchild, same thing. The complexity, the challenge is that if you die intestate, your spouse may not inherit all of the separate property. And that's oftentimes not what people would have wanted.
Right. In either direction. Sometimes they wouldn't want the spouse to have gotten anything. They wanted the family money to go just straight down to their children.
Yeah.
Right. And if it's one child, if the decedent had one child, the surviving spouse would get 50% and the child would get 50%. And if the decedent had two children, the surviving spouse gets a third, and 2/3 is split equally amongst the children or issue of a predeceased child.
Right. And that's the split, no matter how many children if the decedent had 7 children, it's still 1/3, 2/3. But, the point being the children are going to get some, the spouse is going to get some. Maybe that's what you wanted. Maybe it's really not. I think it's probably almost never what they want. You either want your spouse to get it or you want your kids to get it. Very rare does someone say, I think I want my kids to get 2/3, my spouse to get 1/3.
Exactly. Well, and then there's the whole, because they didn't do an estate plan, how do you make these transfers and distributions? That's a whole nother layer as well. If it's just community property, or if everything was going to the surviving spouse, there's a spousal property petition.
Right.
But if there's that component going to the children that's separate property, that's going to require a probate.
You're going to have to do a probate. Yeah. Because it's not a spouse. Yeah. So that's yet another reason to not do that, not die intestate, especially if you've got separate property. Yeah.
Right.
Very good point. Okay. Do you have a horror story that you want to share?
Well, a couple. Well, I'll start with one that's just not as much of a horror story, it's just practical, is if there is a probate open to distribute separate property if the children of the decedent are minors or the, deceased child, the grandkid of the decedent is a minor, then, it starts this issue too of who's representing them in the court proceeding. And that adds a whole nother layer on to the cost expense. They may need to get a guardian ad litem appointed.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point, because a minor child cannot legally inherit. They have to have a guardian to do that. And surprisingly, that person has to be appointed by court. You don't just get to stand up and say, I'm their parent or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, that is a good point.
Right. In terms of horror stories, probably the one I've seen a couple of times recently is there's no estate plan, there's community property and separate property. Someone has filed for a divorce. The divorce judgment is not entered. And the rules we talked